Why do you think people have rights, bro? I'm just curious. You speak about them all the time, but it doesn't really seem legitimate to begin political thought by assuming that people have rights. That is, there ought to be an explanation for why people have rights. But you can't come up with an explanation. There's the explanation we have from classical liberalism with the state of nature, but that is far from satisfying. You might think that rights come from God. Now, I believe in God, but that doesn't suffice either, and I'll explain that in a moment. No, the best secular argument for people having rights is the argument that Jimmy Valmer used to unite the Crips and the Bloods on South Park. I mean, come on. As in, people have rights. I mean, come on. In other words, people have rights as a matter of faith. When you begin political thought with the premise that people have rights, you take it as a matter of faith. Oh yeah, but you're secular and you believe that the Constitution requires the separation of church and state. Never mind that that is a questionable constitutional doctrine concocted in 1947 by the Supreme Court, you accept it. What distinguishes your acceptance of rights from religious belief? Oh, it doesn't have anything to do with the supernatural? Well, when you consider Eastern religions like Buddhism, it becomes clear that the supernatural requirement for religion is just a Western construct. Countries like Bhutan, Cambodia, and Thailand have Buddhism as their official state religion. Presumably, such an arrangement in our country would violate the so-called separation of church and state. But no, in reality, people don't have rights because what is right consists in the particular situation. Even if God is the source for morality, what is right still consists in the particular situation. You can't even seriously discuss what is right without discussing particular situations. My suggestion is that, in reality, the idea that people have rights was a rationalization of the need for private property for the development of capitalism. It is an example of Marx's line that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. You are supposed to believe that you own what is right like you own property, whereas what is right actually belongs to the situation, or if there is anyone to whom what is right does belong, it is that guy on Jersey Shore, Mike, the situation. Consider, what does saying that someone has a right to something contribute to meaning compared to merely saying that it is right that one thing or another happen? For instance, people have a right to healthcare versus it is right that people are provided with healthcare. All that is added is the idea of property. If you were to say to Socrates, "Oh, I have a right to this or that," Socrates would say something like, "How incredible! You own what is right? How wondrous!" In reality, rights is just a name that modern society gives to certain kinds of general rules. Society requires general rules, and what is right consists in the particular situation. Therefore, there are particular situations in which we adopt general rules, the founding of a country especially, and generally setting policy for groups of people. Furthermore, if there really is such a thing as right and wrong, then some general rules are more desirable than others for a particular situation, that is, for a particular group of people. It may be, as in the case of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that your society's general rules are the greatest set of general rules that have ever been politically adopted. I want the best general rules to be adopted, but what is right still consists in the particular situation. Alright, for the benefit of classical liberals, let me say a word about the state of nature theory, which presumably they accept, which is supposedly the condition of people before they enter society, and in John Locke's words, is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions, and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit. And the point being that people have rights because, in order for society to be legitimate, it has to provide people with freedom, etc., that sufficiently compensates for leaving the state of nature and entering society. Now, there is quite a lot to be said about the state of nature theory, which I am kind of surprised people take seriously, even though I understand it because for a number of years I was a classical liberal that took it seriously and promoted it. But there is one fine way that I like to set it up and knock it down. In Locke's same work, he says that an Indian and a Swiss in the woods of America are in a state of nature. But clearly they are already members of societies if only because they are an Indian and a Swiss. People can't even learn to speak unless they belong to a society. I am pretty satisfied that the view of classical philosophy is a much more accurate description of reality. The way Aristotle put it, we are the political animal because we live together by speaking about how to live well. So that deals with the classical liberals. Let's move on to the modern types that don't have anything more to say than, I mean, come on. Alan Bloom has a line about this in his The Closing of the American Mind, where, although he doesn't mention here that he rejects the state of nature like I do, he writes that it is now fashionable to deny that there ever was a state of nature. Everyone believes in freedom and equality and the rights consequent to them. These were, however, brought to civil society from the state of nature. In the absence of any other ground for them, they must be just as mythical as the tale of the state of nature told by the unreliable travelers. And so I'm saying that it is no great tragedy that we don't have rights. That doesn't mean that there is no morality. It just means that what is right consists in the particular situation. Rather, the great tragedy is the prejudice we have in modernity against situational ethics, largely as a result of Machiavelli giving incredibly frank advice to aspiring tyrants. And yet, if you reject situational ethics, then you are hostile to justice, because what is right consists in the particular situation. Someone who accepts situational ethics will probably describe justice better than someone that doesn't. It might be said that rights are rules without which society cannot be just. This is how I described rights to myself when I was a classical liberal. Somehow even then I knew that rights are rules that society has. It seems to me as though something like this is the closest we can get to people having rights. But even so, this doesn't require a rights doctrine, and, as I've already said, any specific alleged right can easily be restated in terms of this or that being right. Also, this still vindicates the situational character of right because we are discussing a particular situation, the minimum requirements for society to be just. Anyway, like I said, a rights doctrine is not necessary for us to understand that society has minimum requirements for justice. After all, Aristotle didn't have a rights doctrine, but you find minimum requirements for justice in his writings. It should be said that the popularizing of a rights doctrine has come along with a dwelling on the minimum aspects of society. People think that they are discussing a more noble society when they obsess over rights, but in reality, the most noble aspects of life are not essential. They are not minimum requirements. And yet they are nonetheless a part of life, and the exclusion of these in modern political thought is really one of the things that recommends the classics, and may make them a superior description of reality. Also, an effect of the rights doctrine has been to implant in people's minds, before there has even been a debate, that government must do something. I think that it is right that people have food, housing, healthcare, etc., but I don't think it is clear that the government is always the best means toward those types of ends. Alright, so let's consider a few additional points as we begin to wrap this up. Let's discuss the difference between the words rights and right. In political science class, we all become familiar with the concept of natural rights. But you never hear of the phrase natural right until you come across Leo Strauss's great book, Natural Right in History. And of course, most people haven't had the pleasure. When I say that ruling out natural rights doesn't mean that there isn't morality. I am saying that ruling out natural rights doesn't rule out natural right. But when you think about it, the distinction isn't between the words rights and right anyway. After all, when we speak about specific rights someone is said to have, we say that they have this right or that right. Rather, the difference is in the verb that accompanies it. We say that someone has rights, or that something is right. This is why I think that rights, as originally being a rationalization of the need for private property, is so compelling. We speak about rights as though they are property, for crying out loud. And the philosophical obsession with property is somewhat new in history. For example, in the current year, the claim that we own ourselves is fairly common, and yet I don't know of any classical examples of such an idea. Certainly, they were much fewer than in our time. Rather, for the classics, the question was whether we rule ourselves, and not merely in a narrow political sense either. The question was whether we rule ourselves according to relatively sober reason, or whether we are ruled by our passions. Socrates would be very unimpressed to learn of the consolation that people ruled by their passions nonetheless own themselves. One more point. Speaking about people having rights so thoroughly permeates our culture that rights are often used as a synonym for power. I have a particularly choice example from Rodney Stark's How the West Won, in which he uses rights this way 3 times in 2 paragraphs. You'll recognize having seen it used this way from your experience. Writing about the control France and Spain had over the Catholic Church in their countries in the 15th and 16th centuries, Stark writes that, beginning in 1296, when King Philip of France successfully imposed a tax on church income, papal authority steadily eroded in France. In 1516, the subordination of the church to the French monarchy was formalized in the Concordat of Bologna, signed by Pope Leo X and King Francis I. This Concordat acknowledged the king's right to appoint all higher church posts in France, 10 archbishops, 82 bishops, and every prior, abbot, and abbess of all the many hundreds of monasteries, abbeys, and convents. If anything, the Spanish crown had even greater power over the church. It had long held the right to nominate archbishops and bishops, to fine the clergy, and to receive a substantial share of the tithes. Then, in 1486, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella gained the right to make all major ecclesiastical appointments, to prohibit appeals from Spanish courts to Rome, to impose taxes on the clergy, and to make it illegal to publish papal bulls and decrees in Spain or its possessions without prior royal consent. So anyway, could you knock it off with these sweeping declarations about who owns what is right that you really have no explanation for and which seem to really be more about modern virtue signaling? Oh, we live in the current year and now we know that people have rights. No, you don't know that, bro. You just speak about rights because everyone else speaks about rights. It was an ideology of a particular ruling class hundreds of years ago, and we can appreciate the use that was gotten out of it. The idea that people have rights was a noble lie that helped usher in modernity. But it isn't really an accurate description of reality, and at this point it is an obstacle to relatively sober discussions about how to live well. Rights are just a name that modern society gives to some of its general rules, and what is right consists in the particular situation.